Tell me, when did you first realize your family was different? Did you have a concept of them being different?
I don't think I ever consciously realized that my family was different in the sense that I woke up one day and say, gee, my family is different from others. And for me, the explanation is very, very simple. I was born into the family. My first communication with my family was the deaf sign languages. Only signs at the time until I learned the alphabet. And I guess if you want to say, when did I learn my family was different, was when other kids started teasing me about signing, and you might see some kid on the street and I'd punch him. I didn't put up with it. And then, of course, again, the same thing applied when some girl's mother might be asking, does he come from deaf parents? With the implication being, don't. So, but no sudden dawning on me that my family was different. I was comfortable in it, and in everything about it.
I remember you telling me that, because I asked once, I think when you were in Akron and I was there at the same time, if you could show me where your house was, and you told me you had a lot of houses.
When I was growing up, I grew up in the Depression area to start off with. And my father worked at Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company as ordinary laborer in what I guess they would call delivery. And what delivery back in those days was, you had a hand cart and you would put stuff on it and take it from shipping up to whatever department you wanted. I lost track.
Houses, lots of houses. I asked you to show me your house when you grew up, and you said there were lots of them.
Okay. Because of the Depression and the job my father had with Goodyear, during the Depression, the rubber factories weren't running full blast. There weren't all that many cars around, number one. And number two, people were pretty chary of buying new tires. So the factory would run 3 days a week, maybe some days 2 days a week, depending on the sort of orders they were getting in. And that reflected in the amount of money my father would bring home to put on the table. And as a result, no better way to put it than we had problems occasionally paying rent. And the landlord would want his rent, and my father didn't have the money to pay for the food and clothing and all, and maybe pay the full rent. So we moved fairly often until I got into high school. But in the growing up years, I think I probably lived in at least 7 or 8 different houses, all in the same part of town, but maybe a couple years in one house and a couple years in another, and it had some benefits in a way. The high school was always the same, Akron East High School. It means that I changed grade schools occasionally. There were 2 principal grade schools that I went to. One was Hotchkiss, and the other was, I forget the name of it now, but you'd hate to move from one school where you were very, very comfortable and knew everybody and knew all the teachers, and then all of a sudden, Father, for economic reasons, had to move to another house, and you went with him, and you're in a completely different schooling atmosphere, different teachers, different place to go, different kids. So it used to be a bit challenging adapting to that sort of thing. But not any big problems. It just the normal childish things of, gee, I don't want to go to school, I don't know anybody, I don't like the school. I'd get over that. And my mother would try to baby me sometimes by walking me to school, and I wouldn't have any of that. But the Depression hit pretty much everybody, except a few parents who were lucky enough to own houses, who were lucky enough maybe to have a job that wasn't affected by the status of the rubber factories. And but for those whose parents worked in the rubber factories, life was kind of rough. I used to get when my shoes would start to wear out, the soles and the leather would start to, you'd get holes in the bottom of your shoe, and you stick cardboard in for a while, and then pretty soon that didn't work. And then you would end up going down to the 5 and dime Woolworth, and you could buy little patches, little stoles that you glued on and cover up. The same with the heels. You couldn't afford to go to a shoemaker. And back in the days of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, you're too young to remember that. At school, they would take you into the gym, and they'd sit you down in the gym, sitting flat on the floor, with your legs stretched out and the bottoms of your feet showing, and they'd come around, and if your shoes were in terribly bad condition, and a lot of them were, they'd give you a pair of shoes. And the shoes were usually the kind of shoes that the construction workers wear now, with the rough, scuffed up leather. But things, and toys, your parents normally couldn't afford to buy toys for you, except maybe a limited few at Christmas time, so you'd make your own. My father would help, and I'd make such things as rubber band guns. And how would I make them? Well, I'd go around, if anybody had an inner tube that they were going to get rid of because it was no good anymore, I'd get that, and we'd cut it up into bands, and you'd cock it up stretch it back on the gun, and on the trigger part was one of these clothespins, that you squeeze, and you could even fix them up so that you could fire more than one rubber band. And we'd make those and run around playing cowboys and Indians. We'd do such things as taking tin cans and put a hole in the bottom of the tin can each side, and stretch them taut and use them as toy telephones. Just all sorts of things. And for ink, we might go out and collect elderberries and squash them up and use the juice to make ink. No TV, so the big thing was the shadow, and the stagings of that sort of thing were just, you probably wouldn't listen to it now, but to me then it was like real life, and appears the shadow. And they had all sorts of radio programs, just voice, that were just marvelously done. A horse like the Lone Ranger, hi-ho, Silver, and somebody would be clack, 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 clack. Uh,
Can you tell me about how Gallaudet maybe prepared, did Gallaudet prepare people like your parents to accept less than in the real world as far as work? How do you feel about that? Or was it just the times?
you know, I'm sort of thinking of that one. I don't think Gallaudet, as good as it was attuned to what the labor market was. And they were teaching sort of regular university type studies. As an example, my father took chemistry and different types of math and this sort of thing. Well, when you went out to get a job, there was nothing like that available. Probably a large number ended up in Akron, Ohio, working in the rubber mills, which were hiring at that time. This was before the Depression. A goodly number ended up in the steel mills, and it was labor jobs. And people who had studied chemistry and that sort of thing were just, unless they were very, very, very lucky, were out in left field when it came to job hunting.
Do you know what your mom studied?
Pardon?
Do you know what your mother studied?
I'm not sure what my mother studied. I am not sure.
I had heard she studied Latin, but that was her major.
She may well have studied Latin, and if she did, that may have been her incentive to get me to take Latin in high school, which I detested. I went up through I went beyond 2 years in Latin. And if I were to take Latin now, I'd enjoy it because there's a language. When I took it then, nobody but the people who studied hard would take that sort of thing. They'd take something like French or whatever. And I didn't like it. So I don't know really what she studied.
Can you tell me anything about their courtship?
About the what?
Their courtship. When they dated, how they got married, you know any stories about? You don't know how they have no idea? Okay. Can you tell me about any time where they expressed an anger about being deaf or some kind of self-pity? Anger or self-pity?
Well, I get asked the question often whether they were bitter about having been born deaf or not. And my answer would be rather mixed. And in general, I would say they were comfortable at being deaf. And they weren't bemoaning the fate that they had been born deaf and in families where everybody, where the other children were okay. Now, they may have been bitter at one time, I don't know, but as adults, they weren't. Now, once my mother, someone thought that she, through a hearing aid, might be able to hear. So some fellow came out and fitted her with a hearing aid. And my father was urging her on to, come on, let's try it. And she didn't like it at all because the sounds didn't mean a thing to her, and I don't know that she was hearing normally anyway. And she threw up her hands and said, no. She says, I don't mind being deaf. I'm comfortable the way I am. Let the hearing people hear, and I'll enjoy life as a deaf person. I think my father probably regretted being deaf because he wasn't able to get a better job. But I don't think he was bitter about it. I never got any expressions of anger over being deaf, or the fact that he had to accept a lesser lot in life than a hearing person with the same degree of education. I think they were comfortable at being deaf, and the deaf community itself was pretty cohesive. It was all encompassing. Club activities were deaf. Outings were deaf. The deaf even had a croquet club, and everybody gathered together and made up a croquet court with overhead lighting, and hooked it into the house next to where the vacant lot was. So they play at night, but people joined in together, and I think we're much more community oriented than the ordinary hearing family, because they had something in common.
Tell me.
But at the same time, it was a very diverse community, because you had all nationalities. You know, let's say you're Italian and you're living in Akron, Ohio. Well, there's a section of town where the Italians live. Well, for the deaf people, there's no such thing, and there's no section for the Jewish that the Jewish deaf could gather. It was the deaf community. So you had watchmakers, cigar rollers, photographers. One was a professional gambler. Literally, that's how he made his living. It just it was an interesting community to grow up in.
Tell me how they referred. Did they ever refer to themselves as handicapped, or how did they refer? And how were they referred to by other people?
I never heard them refer to themselves as handicapped, which to me I think people term pejorative, and I don't think they felt that way. Now, they knew there were certain things they couldn't do, but that was their lot in life. And back in those days, there wasn't this social anger that you run into nowadays, where people are just bitter at the fact that the Lord dealt them a low blow by creating them crippled, or maybe partially blind, or whatever. I never heard anything like that. Now, I wouldn't say that within the total deaf community there might not have been some who felt that way, but I never sensed it. It was a comfortable and interesting community.
Tell me about, you had started telling me before about, about Mom and her family's view towards you or your family.
Well, when I proposed to your mother, and this was just before I went off to the Army in 1942, late 42, I got interrogated by her mother about the deafness in the family. How did they become deaf? Was anybody else deaf in the family? And it was sort of in a disapproving sort of way. I don't blame them. I can well understand why they might have been concerned. But I felt on the defensive, and felt that they thought that your mother was making a mistake in marrying me, and that I assumed that she insisted that's what she wanted to do, and they they weren't nasty about it. That I must admit. Her mother was the strong person in the house. Her father wasn't. Her father was a nice guy, would pretty much go along with almost anything. Her mother could be a little, come on, a little strong. And my feeling was that she was trying to somehow give your mother good reasons why the marriage shouldn't go through.
One of my sisters told me that they had heard a story that it wasn't until it was their engagement party, or that somebody else told mom that you had deaf parents, that you weren't the one that told her.
I'm not aware of how Margie's parents learned that I was deaf. I don't know that it was through me to her and then passed on, or maybe a neighbor up the street. I worked with a neighbor up the street who was a good friend, a fellow by the name of Jim Warner, and he certainly knew my parents were deaf. In fact, he's the one that introduced me to your mother. So I would assume that they knew it before any engagement party or anything of the sort. Now, that's an interesting story, but it's not one that I'm aware of.
Tell me about any social encounters or socializing that your parents did with hearing people. Any socializing? Did they have hearing friends?
Socializing was pretty much confined to the deaf community. We didn't, that I can recall, ever have any hearing friends on the social level, where one would exchange visits with the family and so forth. It was just too difficult because of the language barrier to handle something like that. Now, he obviously had interaction with hearing people at work, because that by and large is who he dealt with. But he by and large would deal with pencil and paper, except on some very basic things. Once he'd worked around there a while, and they got an idea of what different, some very simple signs might be. But we never socialized with hearing families.
Do you have any deaf friends now?
People ask me whether I have any deaf friends now, or old friends from deaf families that I used to know when I was young. I don't have any deaf friends now. There's just no occasion to meet them. I have some very casual deaf friends that I meet over at the monthly sessions over at the Arlington County Library, when they have this monthly session for the deaf or anybody who can sign, although they do have a facility. They hire a couple of deaf language interpreters to interpret during the session, and I'm friends with them casually. All my childhood deaf friends are, I think, dead by now.
How did having deaf parents affect the rest of your life?
People ask me how deaf parents affected the rest of my life. I think one of the things it did was make me sort of a loner. That okay, you're born into a deaf family. Mother, father don't hear. When you cry, nobody hears it. Not a soul. Nobody comes. If you're in the crib crying, You can be shouting your voice out, and nobody is going to come in and see what might be wrong with you. You sort of learn to live solitarily in the family, and that although you like to have friends, you don't feel you need them. Some people have a real need to be out socializing and have, go to the local cafe or bar or whatever, and I don't have that feeling. I'm perfectly happy sitting at home reading a book. Speaking of books, that's one of the things that I think being in a deaf family did, was get me deeply interested in reading. And just any spare moment in growing up, I would be either buying books, and the family helped out in that. The Literary Digest, the Reader's Digest, they used to subscribe to that for me. I used to go to the library that was run by Goodyear down near East High School, and I would go back so often within a day or two after taking out a book, and I'd finished it, that finally they said, "We're going to set your limit at 4." So they'd let me have 4 books, and I was a very clandestine reader. We didn't have much in the way of great batteries that for flashlights or anything of that sort, but we had candles, so I might at night get in a closet, shut the door, and light a candle and read way, way, way after the parents had gone to bed, or even read under the covers, or if I could get away with it, turn on the bedroom light and read until all hours. So it got me deeply, deeply interested in books. It got me interested in music. It got me interested in lots of things that I could do myself, that I didn't have to be part of a team. Now, all my sports, wrestling, cross country, swimming, all individual sports. Now, I used to play sandlot football and that sort of thing, but for real competitive sports, it was all individual achievement and not part of a team, like playing lacrosse or basketball or hockey or whatever. Now, some people would also tell me that sensitive women will say, "Gee, you don't know how to communicate. You don't." And women are that way. A lot of them feel that husbands are not on their wavelength. So I have gotten some of that, but I toss it off, and I don't. My feeling is they've got their own hang-ups, and I've got mine. Mine is I can pretty well get along without most things, and get along on my own, and I don't feel the need for companionship. Not that I don't like it, I do like it, but I'm not seeking it.
Tell me, I remember seeing a picture, and this doesn't have really anything to do with anything, but it's just curious. I remember seeing a picture of you in an Indian suit when you were a kid.
Can you turn that off a minute while I take a break?
Sure. I remember seeing in Scrapbook or something a picture of you in an Indian suit and an article, and you sitting in front of the grocery store, and so can you tell me?
I was quite interested in acting when I was young.
Interesting.
At my grade school, somehow had a teacher of drama, and I don't think they probably called it that then, but an art teacher or whatever, who loved to put on plays. And she would put on plays about Pocahontas and the Indians, and Paul Seipel at the North Pole and all that sort of thing. Well, for one of the plays, they wanted me to dress like an Indian. And the reason I felt comfortable acting is because I'm used to moving my hands around, and the other people sort of dead sticks. So if the teacher would say, do this, well, fine, it felt comfortable with me. In any event, I had my mother make me an Indian suit out of burlap bags, and it took some time to collect the burlap bags, and I got them from a Jewish grocer down at the corner store. And this Jewish, there were two brothers. The burlap bags used to come into the store filled with potatoes. So after a while you could collect, and Mother would wash enough bags, and she sewed me up an Indian suit for this play about Pocahontas and not Pocahontas and the Indians, maybe it is, something about Pocahontas. In any event, and she sewed me up a beautiful Indian costume out of burlap with fringes running down here and fringes running down the side. And so I took part in the play with it, but something rather dangerous happened thereafter, because I used to use it playing cowboys and Indians, and I'd be one of the Indian scalpers. And we used to go out, and there used to be lots of empty lots and woods around. And we'd build a fire and everything. Well, roasting marshmallows by the fire, the fringes caught on fire. And through the Boy Scouts, I learned that when if your clothing catches on fire, what you do is you hit the ground and you start rolling. And I did, but it ruined the Indian costume. That was the end of it. But they had an excellent acting program. So every time there was a play or something, they'd haul me in as the principal actor. And I played Paul Seipel once at the North Pole. I was the principal actor at my graduation from grade school. God knows what the play was, I don't even remember. But I was very comfortable in that sort of thing.
Tell me how old you were when you got your first pair of long pants.
Say again?
Tell me how old you were when you got your first pair of long pants.
My first what?
Pair of long pants, trousers.
Back when I was growing up, the thing was to wear knickers. One didn't wear shorts. So one would wear knickers with corduroy, something of the sort, with a band that would hook around right by the, just below the knee to keep the knickers from riding up. And I never had a pair of long pants in my life until of nice long trousers, other than jeans, until I graduated from grade school, and my parents very nicely bought me a nice blue pair, not just long pants, but a nice blue suit that included long pants, and I was just one happy young fellow, one happy camper when that came. That was the first pair of sort of good dress long pants I ever had. Before that, it was always jeans or something of the sort. And my first jeans I got during a visit to my mother's sister up in Minnesota, there on a farm. And I used to wear coveralls, but I really wanted a pair of jeans. So one day we were out shopping at the local store, sort of a trading store, and they bought me a pair of jeans, that what you think of as jeans, and I was happy as a bug in the rug with them. But the good ones didn't come till graduation from grade school.
Tell me if your parents were born 22 years ago, and they were just finishing Gallaudet and they were just starting out their life today. How do you see with who they were, and what would they tell me what their life would be like? How you would envision it?
I think I would. Well, let me start over. I've sometimes thought of what life would be like for my parents had they been born today. And I think that number one, they'd have gotten an education that would have fitted them for the market now. There are jobs open now that were not even thinkable back in those days. And it's only been, last 10 years or so, that anybody had been really willing to accommodate handicapped workers, whether they be crippled or deaf or hard of hearing or what. And I see deaf now who work for the Bureau of Engravement, who work for some of the newspapers around town, who have all sorts of jobs that my parents probably could have had if they were alive today, but couldn't have then. And life would have been, I wouldn't say a lot more comfortable, because I was very comfortable in the setting I was in, pinching pennies and all, because everybody else was the same. But I think they'd have, God knows where they'd have ended up, but there would be so many more occupations open to them, not only my father, but open for my mother, because one, she's handicapped, and two, she was a woman. And there are umpteen million more jobs open for women nowadays. And of course, she could communicate somewhat with by speaking, although she couldn't hear it, and probably could have gotten a job in an office somewhere, with a clerk's job or something of the sort, and two people working, and maybe I'd have gone off to Harvard or someplace. They certainly could have afforded a better education for me. My education started off at Akron University, and I started out paying $35 a semester, and I earned that money by working on a muck farm.
A what?
A muck farm, M-U-C-K farm, which is, you would know as a truck garden farm. And I used to work in it in the summer, and I'd get up at about 5 o'clock in the morning and go out to Hartville, which was close to Alliance. There's these huge fields of lettuce and radishes and turnips, any kind of vegetable you could name, and work at, when I started out, at about 12 cents an hour, 12 hours a day, but I was happy. I thought it was a good job. And finally, in my senior year in high school, I was making 15 cents an hour, and I thought that was great. And there were some itinerant workers who were getting about 17 and a half, 22 and a half an hour, and raising families on that. And I thought that was good money back in those days.
Let me tell you some of the things that I found in the Gallaudet archives. And maybe we'll do a little test, because they have a whole big huge book ledger that's about probably 3 feet wide by 2 feet tall, and when they open it, it's 6 feet wide by 2 feet tall, and it has different records of different people. They have for your father Clifford Myron Thompson. His father's name. Do you know his father's name?
What was my father's name?
No. What his father's name was?
I don't know what his father's name was.
Joseph M. Thompson. His father's name was William Thompson, like your son-in-law.
Now, I have some records from the Mormon Church that I have dug up.
I've seen him. Do you know what your dad? What his parents did for a living? When it's recorded.
What they what?
What your dad's parents did for a living?
No idea. My guess would be something associated with agriculture.
He said, yeah, here they're farmers.
Yeah.
Now they also have for everybody there in Gallaudet the assigned cause of deafness and the age that they became deaf.
Oh, really?
Your father became deaf at birth, and his assigned cause of deafness was severe fright.
Severe what?
Fright.
Oh, really? Well, that sounds like old medicine. I'm not sure how he became deaf. I'm not sure he didn't become deaf shortly after birth, but anyway.
His date of admission to the university was September in 1911. He actually, according to this, he had this they tell his schooling. 5 years in Ogden, Utah, 1 year in Utah, 2 years in Idaho, and then 5 years in another school in Idaho. They also list a skill that he could do basically a skill, like a work skill, maybe for a job or whatever, and he was a good carpenter.
Now, I can remember the carpentry bit, not that he studied it, but he used to help me out with my rubber guns. He used to help me build the soapbox derby little cars. He was good at carpentry.
And then they said something about any deaf relatives, and in the archives it said two of his brothers or sisters were deaf.
That I'm not aware of.
Then they have your I didn't get where he was born, but I think he was born in. Well, here that place of residence is Income, Idaho, where he lived, and I think they said that he was born there too.
I think my records, and I'd have to look at them, are probably Salt Lake City. And the reason I say that is I think when I managed to tap into the Mormon records, that it showed Salt Lake City. Now, the Mormon records also show that your grandmother was born in Salt Lake City, which is wrong, but that's what their records show.
They say that he has good sight and can hear loud noises. Your mother, do you know where she was born?
Where she was born?
Yeah.
Should have been in Madison Lake or one of the nearby cities.
She resided in Eagle Lake, Minnesota.
Eagle Lake.
She was born in Jamestown, Minnesota.
Yeah. There's a little cluster of towns around there.
Her parents were farmers. She became deaf by pneumonia at 3.5 years old.
I had heard diphtheria, but.
Her date of admission was September 1914. That's 3 years after your dad was. 3 years at public school, 6 years at Faribault.
Faribault was a deaf school.
Yeah. No hearing. Her special skill, marketable skill, is she can sew a little bit. And she communicates by lip reading and talking. And here it has that she has a cousin and a great-grandmother who were deaf.
that could be, I never heard of it.
Their student ID numbers, Clifford Myron Thompson's student ID number is number 1402. Ethel Agnes Doran's student ID number is number 1511. And his birthday was May 5th, 1894. And her birthday was July 7th, 1897.
1897, I recall. But I'm surprised that there was other deafness in the family.
It's interesting, and they were actually trying to trace it and everything. Are you aware of something called the silent worker?
No.
There's a website, it must have been a magazine, and there's an article here. It's called The Deaf in Industrial Rubber Chemistry. And there's an article here on your father. Well, here's an article with a picture, and then there's another article that has the whole article, and also has your stepfather, Foster Gilbert, in the same page. There's an article on both of them in the same page. And your dad at the top,
Yeah.
and there's a picture, and there's an article somewhere about him there. And
Father was a tough one.
Your dad? In what way?
Physically, football and that sort of thing.
Um,
Playing center on a football team.
Are you aware? Do you know anything about your dad and music?
No, I know that once they tried to teach him to talk, and somehow it didn't work out.
Here, they have, in the archives, they have your father as a member of the Gallaudet band. Is that
That's one on me.
playing a musical instrument? Clifford Thompson?
What, maybe the drum?
No, it's looks like, he's holding looks like a French horn or something.
I'll be darned.
Some article looks like in the back row on the right, the second to last row on the right hand side.
Well, my congratulations
Something.
on the research. That's great.
And then there's another picture. I'll get you pictures. Here is a list of the Faribault School, Minnesota School for the Deaf Gallaudet College students. People that went from that school that went on to Gallaudet.
Now, this sewing bit is something that they did with deaf women. Cooking, sewing, that sort of thing, figuring what else can they do? Which they did well in teaching her to cook, except oatmeal.
Here's for your dad, the Student Activities Band 1911 to 1912. The only band at Gallaudet 1911, 1912. That's just the back of the photo.
That is a stunner. I never heard of it. I'm sure that he probably did some other things that I didn't know about, and maybe he wouldn't want me to know about.
They also had, and that I ran out of time there. They have photos of him in his football uniform with the team. They have graduation photo, but they have a picture of him like all lined up with all the football team. There's one in the woods where he's standing there looking all kind of tough. I couldn't find any of Grandma, and I think it's because she didn't graduate. And I would really have to search, because she was probably in the.
I don't think she graduated. I'm
She
not
was there
sure.
she was there for 2 years. That's what it said in the archives. And then this is what I found too. These are copies of their student, basically the alumni, the student cards.
I'm surprised they have stuff from that long ago.
And they pick them up with a glove, a cloth glove. They pick all the documents up. So here's just different information. At different points here, they recorded where she was living in 1937, 1948, her address in 1924, her in August, what is it?
Where was she living in 24?
September 16th, 1920, she married Clifford M. Thompson. 1924, East Akron, Ohio, box 674.
What's the name of the street?
A P.O. box.
Oh, really?
So anyway, and then where she was in 48, East Laird Street in Akron, Ohio.
You
And
shut that thing off again?
You would like me to?
I need another.
So then they have here your dad, Clifford Myron Thompson, some addresses. He graduated, got his BA in 1916 and married your mom in 1920. So I don't know what they were doing for those 4 years after he graduated, or where they were.
Could have been, God only knows, could have been out in Utah.
Well, they have
or-
him in 1916, October 13th, 1916 in Burley, Idaho. And then starting in Akron, Ohio as of March 6th, 1917, starting work there. So then that's 3 more years. So maybe he waited for her to, I don't know, she must have been done by then. So and then this was an ad too about, at the bottom left-hand corner, article about or a little obituary about your dad.
Yeah, they were on vacation up there.
So, and your name's in there.
And I was down in Fort Benning, Georgia. Lieutenant Lawrence Thompson. I got word of his death when we were having a big inspection, and the regimental commander came up in his green sedan and hopped up and said he wanted to talk to me. And he said, "I'm sorry to tell you that your father just died." And he said in a very commanding voice, "And the inspection is over, and I want you to get packed, and I want you to get back up home so you can attend the funeral." And I said, "Well, can't we go on with the inspection a minute?" "No, you heard what I said." I said, "Yes, sir," and saluted and went and got packed.
So what's the greatest lesson your dad gave you and the greatest lesson your mom gave to you, do you think?
If they, I think probably the biggest lesson that I got from my parents was do what you can with what you have, and don't think about what it would have been otherwise. You have what you have, do what you can with it and do the best with it, and no regrets. Plus, and I think a very good demonstration was how they handled life, with no tears, no regrets, no bitterness. This is our life, and we're going to live it, and we're going to enjoy it, and they did.
You got that? Cool. That was great. Excellent.
Born into a deaf family, and just all sorts of things. Don't understand what it's like to have been born into a deaf family, and they think it's terrible. Gee, what a handicap you started out with. And I felt like, gee, what's so what's so terrible about that? I had a happy childhood.
I definitely see how it shaped you, and it was interesting hearing different stories and, you know, interesting.
They were good.